The courtroom air was thick with a silence that pressed on every wall, a stillness so heavy it made every breath feel louder than it should. Light filtered in through the tall, narrow windows, casting long shadows over the polished wooden benches. The usual rustle of papers and murmurs was absent today. Even the judge's gavel, resting quietly on its block, seemed hesitant to break the quiet dot. At the center of this tense stillness sat a little girl named Emily. She was only 6. Her legs, too, short to reach the floor from the witness stand's high-backed chair. Her red Mary Janes swung gently above the wooden floor, brushing the edge of the seat every few seconds in a rhythmic, nervous tap-tap. She clutched a stuffed gray bunny to her chest, ears frayed, one button eye missing, a companion worn. From too many sleepless nights and tearful mornings, Emily's small face was pale, her eyes wide and blank, like a painting that had forgotten its colors. She hadn't spoken much in the days leading up to the hearing. Not to her court-appointed guardian, not to the therapist, not even to her aunt, who had taken her in when everything fell apart. And now she was being asked to do the unthinkable, speak in front of strangers. In front of him, across the room, stood her father, tall, rigid, and cold-eyed. He looked more like a man posing as a parent than someone who had ever cradled her in his arms. He didn't look at Emily, not directly. His gaze swept the courtroom instead, as if gauging his chances, analyzing every glance and posture. Beside him sat his lawyer, a sharply dressed woman with a thick binder, and the look of someone who'd already decided her client was innocent. The judge, an older woman with tired but alert eyes, observed the room with a measured patience. She had seen too many cases like this, where the truth lay buried under fear and silence. But there was something different about this one. Something in the girl's eyes told her this wasn't just about custody. This was about survival. Seated behind Emily was her guardian ad litem, Miss Cardenas, a calm, steady presence in a dark blue suit, her hands folded in her lap. She leaned forward slightly, ready to intervene if Emily froze. They'd practiced testimony for days in a gentle, child-safe way. But practice meant nothing when trauma took the wheel. Every adult in that room seemed to tower like mountains above. The girl, no one spoke. The tension was so thick it felt like glass waiting to shatter. And Emily said nothing. She didn't fidget. She didn't cry. But her body was a study in quiet distress. Her small shoulders hunched defensively, her mouth pressed into a line so tight it almost disappeared. Her eyes never left the floor. When the clerk gently reminded her to speak into the microphone, she gave no response. The judge looked toward Miss Cardenas and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And that was when the side door creaked open. Sound echoed like thunder in the silence. Heads turned. Even Emily looked up. A uniformed officer stepped in, but it wasn't him that caught the attention. It was the figure padding calmly beside him, four-legged, golden-eyed, and solemn as a monk. A German shepherd. He walked with quiet dignity, no leash needed, and paused for just a second at the entrance. The officer gave a subtle gesture, and the dog trotted forward with a gentle grace, stopping beside the witness stand. His name was Justice, and his job wasn't to attack, to sniff for drugs, or to chase suspects. He was there for children. He was there for her. Emily's legs stopped swinging. Her grip on the bunny loosened slightly. Her eyes, blank just seconds ago, lit up with something small but real. Recognition, hope that the silence was broken. Not by words, but by the soft thump of a tail hitting the ground and the unspoken promise that no matter what came next, she wasn't alone anymore. Justice moved through the courtroom like he had done it 100 times before, with quiet, steady steps, his head level, his tail low, his movement intentional. The German shepherd's coat was a mix of deep sable and ash gray, glinting slightly beneath the overhead lights. His ears twitched with each creak of the wooden benches. But his amber eyes were locked onto his mission. Emily. He had been trained for moments like this. Not to bite, not to bark, not to chase, but to listen. To comfort. To protect. When justice reached the stand, he didn't hesitate. He lowered himself to the floor beside Emily's chair, positioning his body so close to her feet that the tip of his tail gently brushed against her leg. Then he sighed, a soft, low breath, and rested his head on his front paws. The judge didn't speak, and no one objected. It was clear this had been prearranged. Emily's guardian had petitioned the court to allow justice to assist during her testimony. This was part of a newly approved program that permitted therapy, K-9 South, in select legal proceedings involving minors, especially those who had experienced trauma. What no one had expected was the change in the room. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt lighter. The dread that had hung so heavy over the courtroom seemed to ease. Emily's posture changed ever so slightly. Her knees turned inward, her fingers unclenched, and her eyes, once darting between walls and faces, settled on the calm figure. At her feet, she leaned forward, just barely, and reached out a hand to touch the K-9's thick fur. Justice didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply accepted the contact as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The connection had been made. Her guardian, Miss Cardenas, gave a small nod of encouragement, her voice soft but steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, Emily may begin testimony now." The judge looked at Emily. "Are you ready to speak, sweetheart?" Emily didn't answer right away, but she gave a tiny nod. Her voice hadn't yet returned, but her fear was no longer total. What most people couldn't know, was what this dog meant to her. A week earlier, during a supervised preparation session, justice had been introduced to Emily in a private, low-stress setting. While other children sometimes needed coaxing, Emily had gone straight to him, kneeling on the floor, wrapping her arms around his neck. She hadn't said a word then either, but something had passed between them. A kind of unspoken agreement. "I'll protect you if you trust me." Now, sitting beside her in a courtroom filled with strangers and shadows from her past, he was proving good on that promise. Officer Daniels, Justice's handler, stood quietly in the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed. He had seen justice work magic before, seen children unlock, adults cry, entire interviews shift from resistance to revelation with just the presence of his K-9 partner. But this moment felt different. Justice wasn't just grounding Emily. He was anchoring the entire room. The defense lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable. She leaned toward her client, Emily's father, and whispered something hurriedly. He scowled, arms crossed, jaw tight. Justice turned his head slightly at the movement, not aggressively, but with awareness. He was watching him. Quietly, intently. Emily noticed. She leaned a little closer to the microphone, but said nothing. Not yet. Still, that small movement, that faint reach toward Justice's fur, told everyone in the room that something had shifted. A moment ago, she was silent and sealed shut. Now, a door had cracked open. The judge, sensing the delicate momentum, simply nodded. "Take your time, Emily. We're all here for you." The next few seconds felt like minutes. Emily's eyes stayed on Justice. Then, slowly, almost inaudibly, she opened her mouth to speak, and what she said next would leave the courtroom stunned. The room held its breath. The microphones were on, but Emily's voice was so soft it barely registered. Only those closest could make out the faint tremble of her lips. The court reporter paused, leaning in ever so slightly. The judge didn't interrupt. No one did. Everyone sensed that if they pushed too hard, too fast, the fragile thread holding this moment together might snap. Emily's gaze didn't move from the dog. Justice's warm body was steady, unmoving. His head remained low, his ears twitching. At every rustle in the room, his calm was contagious, grounding Emily like a lighthouse in fog. Then, with a breath so shallow, it was almost a whisper, Emily raised her hand and pointed, not at the judge, not at her father, but at the K-9 curled beside her feet. Her voice came next, fragile, trembling, but clear enough. He knows. A murmur rolled through the courtroom like distant thunder. Miss Cardenas blinked. The judge leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry, Emily," she said gently. "Could you say that again?" Emily turned toward the microphone, still pointing at the dog. Her eyes didn't leave his face. Her second utterance was stronger this time, though her voice still carried the weight of fear and memory. "He knows," she repeated, then added, barely above a whisper, "He saw." A beat passed. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. But it felt like a lifetime. Justice didn't move, but his ears perked just slightly at her voice. He gave a faint exhale, like a breath of solidarity. Emily's fingers curled around a patch of fur at his side and stayed there, grounded, held, safe. The silence was broken only by the gentle scratch of the court reporter's pen, transcribing every word as if they were etched in stone. "He knows. He saw." What did she mean? The judge turned to Miss Cardenas. "Can you clarify?" Miss Cardenas looked briefly to Emily. "Emily, are you saying that Justice, the dog, was there?" Emily hesitated. Then quietly she shook her head. "Not there when it happened, but when Daddy came, Justice knew." She looked down, her voice cracking. "He barked. He growled. He got between us. He knew Daddy was bad." Across the courtroom, the defense lawyer straightened sharply. "Objection. The child is anthropomorphizing the animal." The judge raised her hand. "Overruled." "Let her finish." Emily kept speaking, slowly, haltingly, but with a clarity that stunned everyone. "When Daddy came to visit at my aunt's house, Justice barked like he was mad. He never barked before. But that day, he barked at Daddy, and he wouldn't move from in front of me." It wasn't what she said that struck the room. It was how she said it. She wasn't describing a dog trick. She was recounting an instinct. The pure, unfiltered reaction of a trained animal with an uncanny ability to sense distress, danger, and emotional trauma. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something else, something visceral, something terrifyingly real. Officer Daniels stood quietly at the back of the room, watching it all unfold. He had seen Justice react to people in unusual ways before, flinching away from some, leaning into others, growling once or twice without cause. Or so it had seemed. But this time, everything clicked. Justice had never reacted violently, never broken training. But when Emily's father had walked into the pre-trial visit weeks ago, the dog had gone tense, defensive, protective. Daniels had noted it in his log, uncertain if it would ever matter. Now, it did. The courtroom seemed frozen in a collective pause. Even Emily's father, usually unreadable, looked uneasy. His brow twitched. His eyes flicked toward Justice, then quickly away. He shifted in his seat. The little girl, so silent for so long, had spoken 5 words. He knows. He saw. And no. They were not a formal accusation. They were more powerful than any witness statement the court had heard all day. The judge looked down at her notes, then at Emily, then at the dog. She didn't need confirmation yet, not now. The truth was inching out on its own. For the first time in the trial, the room had something no lawyer could manufacture. Belief. The tension in the courtroom became electric, almost tangible. It was as if Emily's words had sliced through a veil no one dared touch. He knows. He saw. They weren't just words from a frightened child. They were a message. A warning. A quiet accusation dressed in innocence. carried on the back of a dog's silent testimony. The defense table shifted first. Emily's father, usually composed, stiffened visibly. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering rapidly. He didn't respond, only glanced sideways at Justice, who now sat upright, ears perked, his large body calm but alert. The connection between Emily and the dog had gone from comforting to uncanny. The judge didn't speak. She watched. Everyone did. Ms. Cardenas cleared her throat. Your Honor, she said cautiously. Emily's response may sound metaphorical, but I believe there is a deeper behavioral truth behind what she's saying. The defense attorney stood. With all due respect, Your Honor, the child is assigning emotional memory to an animal. This is speculative at best and misleading at worst. The dog isn't a witness. He can't testify. He cannot. The judge held up a hand. Sit down, counselor. No one is claiming the dog can speak. But we are here to understand the emotional and environmental context of this child's experience. She feels this dog recognized something. That's relevant, not because the dog can talk, but because of how the child responded to him. The defense attorney hesitated, lips pursed, but obeyed. Justice, meanwhile, remained still. He had shifted subtly to lean into Emily's leg. She rested her hand on his back now, fingers twitching against his soft fur like she was grounding herself, drawing courage from him. Her eyes stayed low, avoiding her father's gaze, but her voice had begun to find strength. He didn't like Daddy, Emily said suddenly. Gasps were audible this time. Not dramatic, just small, involuntary inhales from the audience behind. The railing. Emily's father narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He barked at him before anyone else came in. She continued. And he wouldn't leave my side after. He just knew. Like he was saying, I'm here now. You're okay. The judge looked toward the back of the room. Officer Daniels, would you come forward? A handler stood and approached. The front, calm and composed. He wore a neatly pressed uniform, his badge polished, his expression neutral, but beneath it, there was a storm of memory. Officer, the judge began, can you confirm whether the K-9 demonstrated any reaction to Mr. Weller, the defendant, during their first meeting? Daniels nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I logged the behavior in my report. Justice displayed defensive posture, stood between the child and the adult, and barked repeatedly until I intervened. That was the only time he has ever reacted that way. During a child advocacy session. The courtroom rustled again. Miss Cardenas leaned in. And have you trained Justice to detect behavioral cues or emotional trauma responses? Yes, ma'am, Daniels replied. Justice is a dual-certified K-9, both comfort and response trained. He's been trained to identify signs of distress in children and to respond non-aggressively, but defensively when he senses fear or danger. The defense attorney interrupted, clearly agitated. Are you saying the dog can read minds now? No, Daniels said calmly. But he reads hearts better than most adults do. A quiet awe swept through the courtroom. Even the stenographer paused for a beat before continuing. Emily's words had triggered something that could no longer be dismissed as childish fantasy. The pieces were aligning, not perfectly, but unmistakably. A child too frightened to speak. A dog trained to notice things others missed. And a father who had somehow triggered a response in both. The judge leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. Let's continue, she said, her voice softer now. Because I believe there's more. And there was. The dog may not have seen the events in question, but Emily had. And now, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to tell the world what she remembered. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a living story, unfolding, shifting, changing in real time. The judge, now leaning slightly forward with steepled fingers, had one eye on Emily and the other on Officer Daniels. Her silence was deliberate, inviting truth without force. No one interrupted. Even the defense attorney seemed to understand that something far bigger than a custody hearing was unraveling here. Justice sat patiently at Emily's side, the picture of focus. Though he hadn't made a sound since Emily's revelation, his presence had already spoken volumes. Now it was time for context. Officer Daniels, the judge said clearly, you stated that Justice is a dual-certified K-9. Please elaborate on what that means for the court. Daniels nodded, stepping slightly closer to the bench. Yes, Your Honor. Justice is a specially trained German Shepherd who works in both emotional support and forensic advocacy. In short, he's trained to provide calming support for trauma victims, particularly children, during interviews, hearings, or testimonies. But he also receives training similar to behavioral alert dogs. Behavioral alert? Ms. Cardenas asked from her seat. Can you explain? Yes, ma'am. Justice has been trained to recognize stress responses, elevated heart rate, fear pheromones, vocal distress, changes in posture, and energy shifts in a room. He's trained to identify those signs and respond either passively, by positioning himself near the victim, or actively, by placing himself between the victim and a perceived threat. The judge looked intrigued. And how often does he respond actively? Rarely, Your Honor, Daniels said. In over 50 child interviews, he's responded actively only twice. The first was with a child who later disclosed physical abuse. The second, he paused, glancing toward Emily. Was this case? The room went still again. Emily's hand gently scratched behind Justice's ear, a soft, repetitive motion. She wasn't looking at her father. Not anymore. Her attention was fully on the dog beside her, and the words being said about him. And what exactly did Justice do? The judge pressed. Daniels pulled a small notepad from his pocket and read from a logged entry. During the supervised pre-trial visit, Justice positioned himself between Emily and her father, Mr. Weller. His posture was rigid, his ears were forward, and he began low-level growling. When Mr. Weller stepped forward, Justice barked, twice, loudly. I intervened and placed him in a passive downstay position, which he complied with immediately, but he continued watching Mr. Weller until the visit ended. Had he ever done that before? Never in a courtroom or family setting, Your Honor. Not once. The defense stood again. Your Honor, again, we're giving this animal a voice it doesn't have. Dogs bark. Dogs growl. They can react to anxiety or unfamiliar smells. The judge held up her hand once more. Counselor, we are not suggesting Justice testify. But what we are establishing is that the child, who has shown consistent silence and trauma indicators, has placed trust in a trained, regulated response dog. The dog's actions, as documented, coincide with the presence of the individual under investigation. That, whether you agree or not, is not coincidence in the eyes of this court. Daniels continued, in most of our child-focused cases, dogs, like justice work, has silent support. But sometimes, they do what we can't. They sense danger where we overlook it. They connect dots we haven't drawn yet. Emily looked up. Justice was scared for me, she said, softly but firmly. That's why he barked. Her voice had changed, no longer trembling or unsure. She was speaking with something new. Behind it, confidence, not just in her dog, but in herself. The judge looked over her glasses at Mr. Weller. He met her gaze briefly, then looked away. Noted, she said, and marked something on her pad. Outside the courthouse, the world went. On traffic, voices, the passing breeze. But inside that room, a quiet war was being won. Not with yelling, not with outrage, but with 5 words, a child's trust and a dog who listened. The courtroom, once so rigid and cold, now felt like a fragile heartbeat, pulsing with emotion, barely contained by walls and procedure. Emily sat taller in her seat. Justice, ever her silent sentinel, rested quietly beside her. His eyes flicked to her occasionally, almost as if waiting for her to take the next step. Her hand still rested on his fur, fingers now calm, no longer trembling. The judge leaned forward gently. "Emily, you're doing very well. If you feel okay, we'd like to hear what you remember in your own words. You don't have to be afraid. You're safe here." Emily blinked slowly. Then, in a voice still soft, but no longer uncertain, she spoke. "He used to yell a lot." The words were simple, but they struck like thunder. Miss Cardenas nodded gently. "Who, sweetheart?" Emily looked down. "Daddy. He yelled at Mommy all the time, sometimes at me too. He said I was noisy, that I made him angry." She paused. Her hands clenched into small fists. "But I was just playing." Justice lifted his head slightly, sensing her rising heartbeat. Emily immediately placed her hand on his side again, and his body still. Emily continued. "Sometimes when Mommy wasn't home, he'd lock me in the dark room, just so he could have peace," he said. Her voice faltered, but she pushed through it. "No lights, no sounds, just me." Gasps fluttered through the room like birds, startled from a tree. The defense attorney scribbled something furiously on a notepad. "Mr. Weller," Emily's father, looked straight ahead, his jaw tight. But the mask was beginning to slip, a glint of something uneasy in his eyes. The judge spoke gently. "Emily, do you know why you're here today?" Emily nodded slowly. "So you can decide where I live." "That's right," Miss Cardenas said softly. "And do you want to stay with your aunt?" "Yes," Emily said without hesitation. "She hugs me when I cry. She never yells." There was a pause. Then the judge asked, "And do you want to go back to live with your father?" Emily looked down again, but then she turned to Justice, who was now watching her closely. She reached out, stroked his ear, and whispered, "He remembers." A hush fell once more. The judge didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't need to. The silence carried the weight of something irreversible. "Justice doesn't bark at everyone," Emily said. "He only barked when Daddy walked in. I didn't know if I could tell anyone, but when Justice barked, I knew he remembered too. That it really happened, that I wasn't making it up." The room was silent, suspended in the truth of her words. It wasn't just what Emily had experienced. It was that she had doubted her own pain until someone, even if it was a dog, believed her first. That belief, however unconventional, had become the lifeline she needed to finally speak. Officer Daniels stepped forward again. "Your Honor," he said, "I know it may be unorthodox, but in my years working with trauma survivors, especially children, I've learned this. Sometimes it's not about what we prove. It's about what they feel safe enough to reveal. And if Justice helped her feel that safety, then he's done his job better than any of us ever could." The judge didn't reply immediately. She was still watching Emily, this small girl, who had entered the courtroom as a silent shadow and was now standing in her truth. "Thank you, Emily," the judge finally said. "You were very brave today. And Justice, good boy." Justice's ears perked slightly at the praise. He blinked and lowered his head back down on his paws. For the first time in weeks, Emily smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't loud. But it was real. And that changed everything. The courtroom was still, breathless, waiting. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered in through the tall windows, casting long beams of gold and amber across the wooden floors. Dust swirled gently in the light, as if time itself had slowed to witness what was about to happen. The judge looked over her reading glasses, her expression unreadable as she reviewed her notes. The thick manila file before her had been filled with reports, transcripts, psychological assessments, but now it was the smallest voice in the room that had reshaped everything. Emily sat quietly beside Justice, her hand resting on his back, like it always belonged there. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. She was waiting, the way only a child who had learned patience through pain could wait. Justice remained steady, his head resting on her feet, his breathing slow and rhythmic. Ms. Cardenas sat on one side, eyes fixed on the judge. On the other side of the room, Mr. Weller's lawyer whispered something again, but this time he didn't react. He just stared blankly ahead, his jaw set, lips pressed into a line too tight to speak. The silence broke when the judge finally spoke. "I've reviewed all the testimony, including the reports submitted by Child Protective Services, the Guardian, ad litem, and the behavioral logs provided by Officer Daniels and the K-9 program." She paused and looked directly at Emily, not as a case number, not as a minor, but as a person. "I want to thank you, Emily, for being incredibly brave today. It takes a special kind of strength to speak the truth, especially when it's scary. You should know that your voice has been heard, loud and clear." Emily blinked slowly. Her fingers curled slightly into Justice's fur. He didn't move, but he seemed to exhale with her. The judge turned to the courtroom. "It is the ruling of this court that full permanent custody be awarded to Emily's maternal aunt, Miss Heather Alden. All visitation rights with the biological father are hereby suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation and psychological review." Gasps, whispers. One or two people in the gallery nodded quietly, but no one cheered. This wasn't that kind of victory. It wasn't joyous. It was somber. A weight lifted, not thrown. Mr. Weller's face drained of color, but he didn't argue. Maybe he knew it was coming. Maybe the bark of a dog had rattled something loose in his conscience. Or maybe he simply understood at last that the courtroom wasn't fooled by silence. Not Emily's, not his. The bailiff stepped quietly behind him. A routine signal, and Mr. Weller rose. His footsteps echoed across the courtroom floor like empty gunshots as he was escorted through the double doors. Not in cuffs. Not yet. But under the heavy watch of the system he'd once avoided. Emily didn't watch him leave. She looked at the judge, then down at Justice. And only then did her expression change. Her lips trembled, her eyes glossy. Miss Cardenas placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and for the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, Emily let herself lean, not because she was scared, but because she knew it was over. Justice stood up and turned slightly, nudging her with his head. The room softened. Even the stenographer, who had remained impassive for hours, wiped a quiet tear. The judge smiled, just a little, and said, "Court is adjourned." The gavel tapped once. It didn't echo. It settled. The case was over, but the story was just beginning. Emily rose from her chair, holding Justice's leash gently in one hand and her stuffed bunny in the other. She walked toward the exit with her aunt beside her. But before stepping outside, she paused, looked back at the courtroom, at the place where she had reclaimed her voice, and whispered something no one heard, except perhaps Justice. And he wagged his tail in reply. Outside the courthouse, the storm had passed, not the kind with rain and thunder, but the kind that lives in hearts. The wind was soft, brushing through the leaves and the trees that lined the stone steps. The summer sun had started its descent, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold, as if the world itself was exhaling. Emily stood just past the heavy courthouse doors, her small frame shadowed by the towering columns behind her. One hand gripped the handle of her stuffed bunny, the other still rested lightly on Justice's leash. But she wasn't holding it tightly now. She didn't need to. Justice walked beside her because he wanted to, not because he was told. Had stepped out of the courtroom, and into something new, something lighter. Freedom, perhaps. Or maybe just peace. A few reporters had gathered at the sidewalk, whispering into microphones and holding phones toward the courthouse doors. But none of them shouted questions. They didn't need to. The story was already spreading. Not about a dramatic verdict or legal twist, but about a little girl, a silent dog, and the truth they uncovered together. Emily didn't speak to them. She didn't even glance in their direction. Instead, she looked up at her aunt, who offered a soft smile and knelt beside her. "You okay?" her aunt whispered. Emily nodded. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were different now. Brighter, clearer. Not fully healed, but no longer haunted. "Can Justice come home with us?" she asked quietly. Her aunt's smile faltered only for a moment. "I don't know, sweetheart. He works with Officer Daniels. But maybe. Sometimes. Just sometimes." Emily repeated, satisfied. Justice sat beside her, his tongue lolling out slightly, his posture relaxed now that the tension had lifted. His job was done. But in his eyes, there was still watchfulness. Dogs like him didn't stop working just because the courtroom door had closed. They carried memories too, in ways no one could explain. Emily crouched down beside him, folding her dress under her knees. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her cheek into his thick fur. "Thank you," she whispered. Justice blinked, leaned into her embrace, and gave a soft grunt of contentment, the kind dogs make when they know everything is finally okay. Officer Daniels stood a few feet away, watching quietly. He'd seen Justice connect with children before, but this was different. This wasn't just a comfort moment. This was a bond built through shared silence, through trust without words. He walked over and crouched beside them. "You were really brave in there," he said to Emily. She looked up. "Justice helped." Danielle smiled. "Yeah, he tends to do that." A soft chime sounded, a notification from someone's phone. Then another, and another. The story was already spreading online. Little girl points at K-9 in court. What she says next stuns everyone. That was the headline making the rounds. But the truth of it couldn't be captured in a headline. It wasn't just about what she said. It was about how she found the strength to say it. Emily stood up, brushing off her dress. She reached down to take her aunt's hand and looked back at the courthouse one more time. Not with fear, but finality. The building behind her no longer held shadows. Justice gave a soft bark, not loud, just one. She smiled. "Let's go home," her aunt said, her voice quiet. They walked away slowly, the weight of the past lifting with every step. Justice walked beside them for a while, before Officer Daniels gently called him back. He obeyed, but not before brushing his nose against Emily's hand one last time. A silent promise. "If you ever need me again, I'll come." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world moved on. But somewhere in that town, in a small house with open windows and laughter just beginning to return, a little girl was safe, because someone believed her, because someone listened, and because a dog named Justice never left her side.